Now this morning we are going to be continuing as we lead up to Christmas, speaking about the characters of Christmas. And as we look at some of the most recognisable people throughout the Christmas story, it would be remiss of us to look past the shepherds, some key people within the Christmas story. Now, I've mentioned previously that prior to becoming a pastor, there were a few different labouring jobs that I did when I first got out of school. In 2010, I began my work year by temporarily working, doing some labouring work for an electrician in our church. This work was not too bad. I had to crawl in roofs a lot and it was pretty hot, but it was good work to do. Anyone I had to work with, they were always fairly respectful and we got along really well. There were certain times that I might have done something wrong, and the guy who was in charge, he would always help me to fix up the things that I had done wrong. I ended up finishing with this guy and I got asked by another guy in my church if I could help out with some concrete labouring for him. And I said yes, and I thought that this would be very, very similar to the electrical labouring that I had done. It didn't quite turn out that way. The owner of this business, he was a lovely Christian man, one of the elders at the church, but some of the guys that I needed to work with were a little bit more rough and tough than the electrical guys that I had worked with. I mixed with a different sort of tradies than what I had before and what I was used to. The language that they used was a little bit rougher. They weren't really that keen on helping you if you made a mistake. And every single time that you tipped a wheelbarrow load of wet cement, you had to buy every other worker a carton of beer or Pepsi Max. That was the rule. And on my very first day, they loaded up my wheelbarrow with wet cement, and when I thought it was full, they kept going, and they kept going, and they kept going, and they kept going. I ended up tipping out 2 barrow loads on my first day, and my first day was fairly redundant. I essentially lost everything that I earned on that day by needing to buy all of the other guys a carton. From that point on, I tipped no more wheelbarrows over as I did that labouring job. Now, when you picture the shepherds, these are not the sweet, lovely little guys who take care of little lambs. These are hardened, the rough and tough guys who fight off animals regularly. They're the concreters of the ancient world. They sleep in the wilderness using rocks for pillows. They never shower, and they are always covered in dirt. These are the toughest guys that you can possibly face. Picture them like the guys that you see on the screen right now. That is far more accurate of what the shepherds would have been like than some of our nativity scenes make them out to be. So have that picture in your mind as we read right now about the shepherds and what happened to them. We'll be reading from Luke 2, 1 to 21, and it will be up on the screen as well. And it says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, 'Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Saviour has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. And this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger.' Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, 'Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favour rests. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. When they had seen this, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he was conceived. Now, to start off our time together as we begin to look at this story, particularly around the shepherds, and to help you understand the shepherds a little bit more, I want to speak to something that has zero controversy around it at all. And what I want to speak about is the nature of politics around the world from the past 50 years. Get ready. There have been these regular pendulum swings that have happened in politics around the world over the past 50 or so years. The 70s, that marked a time of progressive politics around the world. Then the 80s marked a time when the pendulum swung the other way and there was a rise of conservatism with leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. When we hit the 90s, the pendulum seemed to sit fairly in the middle for quite a long time, probably until about the mid-noughties, the time that I spent growing up. And so you had some fairly centrist leaders like Tony Blair in the UK, Bill Clinton in the USA, even in Australian politics. We had John Howard and Kim Beazley for such a long time, and sometimes it was hard to distinguish the differences. But then the pendulum began to swing towards progressivism once again, and has been that way for about the past 15-ish years. And that's fairly consistent around the entire world. But we seem to be in this period of history, even right now, where the pendulum is swinging once again. Several nations in Europe have voted for some fairly conservative leaders over the past 12 months. In the USA, the Republican Party won by a bit of a landslide. And even in our own state, we've seen the Liberal Party come into power in a state which has been predominantly led by Labor throughout my lifetime. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because typically, what happens in society is when the pendulum swings one way, one group of people have power and another group of people will become marginalised. And when the pendulum swings the other way, those who used to have power then become marginalised, and then those people who once were marginalised have power. And this is normal within societies. This swing continually seems to happen, and it's typically generational. Young people, they will generally see some of the weaknesses of the systems that have been used by those who are older than them, and during some of their formational years, they'll develop these convictions as to how things are able to be done better. And that usually means swinging the pendulum the other way. Now, the time that this doesn't really apply and this doesn't really happen is when those who are marginalised to the extent that their persecution is put into writing into the law of the nation. Once that happens, irrelevant of whether the pendulum swings one way or the other, they will continue to be a marginalised group. And it's immensely difficult for this to be overturned. As an example, the only way that slavery was able to be overturned in the USA was through the Civil War, in which about 700,000 soldiers were killed. The reason for that is because slavery wasn't simply just a cultural norm that swung with the pendulum, but it was written into the law of the land, which is far more difficult to change. Now, this gets even more complex and more difficult when the law of a country is not just their national law, but it's their religious law. Throughout much of history, and even in many countries today, particularly in the Middle East, there is no separation between a nation's law and religious law. they are seen as one and the same. And during the time of Jesus, there was nationalistic and religious laws that were together that specifically sought to keep shepherds as being a marginalized group. One of the most common metaphors for God in the Old Testament is that God was a shepherd. That's fairly common for us. And not only that, but their most respected Jewish king, King David, he began his life as a shepherd. And for that reason, there was a stage that shepherds were fairly well respected within Jewish society. But unfortunately, being a shepherd did not always attract the most quality people. And many shepherds, they would begin to take advantage of people in society. Sheep, they were a necessary commodity within Jewish culture. They would obviously provide food, but they would also provide clothing. And they would also provide what was needed to be able to complete certain sacrificial rituals to be able to make you ritually clean. And the shepherds would mark up their prices to ridiculous amounts because they knew that people needed to buy sheep from them. And so over time, they began to be considered on the same level as tax collectors and sinners. In regards to the pecking order, it would go men, women and children, slaves, shepherds, tax collectors, and sinners. Shepherds were considered below slaves because slaves at least had some level of value tied to them, whereas shepherds, they were simply seen as a necessary evil in which to be able to make society function. And so over a period over about 100 years, between 600 and 500 BC, there was this Jewish text written called the Mishnah. The Mishnah, it was considered secondary to the Old Testament. However, it sought to build on what was contained within the Old Testament. And what it would do is it would provide very practical laws on how you were to live out what was in the Old Testament. And so when you see Jesus throughout the Old Testament rebuking Pharisees for being rule keepers and forcing other people to keep rules that aren't given by God, those were the laws, many of them contained within this book, the Mishnah. And several of these laws in the Mishnah, they related to how you were to treat shepherds. In particular, the Mishnah stated that shepherds are incompetent and that if a shepherd falls into a pit, no one should feel obligated to rescue them. Here are some other direct quotes from the Mishnah regarding shepherds. Whenever the prevailing assumption is that an article is stolen, one is forbidden to purchase it. Similarly, if the majority of a particular substance is stolen, one is forbidden to purchase it. Therefore, one should not purchase wool, milk, or lambs from shepherds. So the assumption right there is that everything that shepherds have is stolen. Another quote. In the case of a shepherd who is herding animals of others, and he left his flock to come into town, and in the meantime a wolf came and tore an animal to pieces, or a lion came and trampled one of the flock, we do not say definitively that had he been there, that he would have rescued them, and therefore he is liable due to his absence. So if a shepherd was looking after someone else's flock, they need to go into town for some resources, something attacks the animals, they are then liable for that. And the reason is they probably wouldn't have protected them anyway, according to this book. And this is how shepherds were viewed in society at the time. They didn't really want them to exist. They are viewed as untrustworthy and as liars and as thieves. They're outcasts of the whole society. Probably the best word you could use to say how shepherds were viewed is they were viewed like pirates. And that's how they would have been treated throughout their entire lives. It was typical for most Jewish boys to go into the trade of their father. So can you imagine being a young Jewish boy, going along to Jewish school to learn the Torah, and throughout your entire childhood, you're being bullied and marginalized and considered an outcast because of the occupation that you are being born into. Shepherds, they lived hard lives, where they were always considered the worthless of society. They were the ones who no one could possibly ever love, the ones who barely are considered worthy to live. But at Christmas, everything changes. The shepherds, they are chosen as the very first people to see the Messiah being born. They are the first people to see God come to earth in human form. They are surrounded by angels singing to God and choosing them to be the first ones to see Jesus. Shepherds, they were never chosen first for anything. In school, they would have been the last one to be picked on a team. But here, these outcasts, they are picked to see Jesus first. And I love this, because throughout the entire Christmas story, it seems that God is trying to demonstrate that he has come for those who are viewed as the least within society. And there is no clearer, more stark way to display that than to get shepherds to be the first ones who would view Jesus. And the message that they receive is that Jesus will come to bring good news of great joy for all the people. Now, most languages, they have different words to express this word joy. For us in English, we have happy or cheerful or joyful, and that's the same within the Jewish and Greek languages, which were the predominant languages of the Bible. But here the word joy, it comes from this word chara. Everyone say chara, need a bit of cha within it. Now, throughout the Bible, there are two things that are apparent when it comes to chara. Those things that are sources of joy, and how joy is a key theme running throughout the entire Bible. From the very beginning, it's seen that we should take joy through the creation that we have been blessed with. What we have in creation has been created as very good and has been blessed by God from the beginning. This is brought with clarity throughout much of the books of Proverbs and Psalms. We can find joy in creation through good food, through marriage, through children, through friends. But the issue is that through the entire Bible and throughout all of human history, it's fairly easy to see that joy hasn't been a key feature in how we've lived our lives. And yet biblical joy seems to have been based far more than just having the right circumstances coming our way so that we might be able to live more happily. Biblical joy seems to come through faith in the promises and the love of God and what he will accomplish. Throughout this, the Bible is really, really clear. When the Israelites, they're released from slavery, they sing for joy to God. When they're in the desert, they were found rejoicing. When Israel was persecuted by foreign empires, they found joy in Yahweh and his promises, that one day there would be one to bring great joy to his people. And this is why Jesus, coming to bring joy, is such a key theme within the Christmas story. The joy that Jesus came to bring is just one more marker that he was the Messiah who was set to come. He wasn't some dictator to bring domination and despair towards other nations. He came to bring joy to all nations and all people. And this continues into the New Testament church. We see the outworking of this in the New Testament church. The New Testament church, it was marked by its joy in comparison with other people around the world. Matthew 5:12, it says, "Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The book of Philippians from Paul, it has joy as the central theme of the entire book. And this form of joy, it does not in any way mean ignoring the pain and the difficulty that you might face in life. That's not a healthy way for you to process your life. Paul himself in 2 Corinthians 6 verse 10, he spoke about how he was sorrowful and yet always rejoicing at the same time. And all of this is possible only by Jesus coming to the world. Tim Mackey says it like this: "This is very different from the tried advice to turn that frown upside down. Christian joy is a profound decision of faith and hope in the power of Jesus' own life and love. And that's what biblical joy is all about. And so here is the big point as to whether all of us are feeling joyful today. Now, whenever I read about joy in the Bible and I'm confronted with the nature of how people were experiencing life throughout the New Testament, sometimes I can find it quite difficult to comprehend that they had this level of joy that is spoken about in the Bible. They were savagely persecuted throughout the New Testament church, and yet we see so many stories of them rejoicing and finding joy despite the circumstances that they have in their life. It genuinely seems like their circumstances, that they were not the major factors that influenced whether they experienced joy or not in their lives. Even when it comes to the shepherds here, they were still the marginalized ones even after Jesus came. That part of their situation did not change. They were still marginalized and outcasts of society. It's just now they had a level of joy presented to them through the angels when Jesus came. And it's through them and through all the believers in the New Testament that we see this truth, that the coming of Jesus, it was good news for all the people, as the angel said, including the marginalized. Whether or not you have ever felt like a marginalized person or an outcast in any group, Jesus has a heart for you, probably more than anyone else, that you might be able to experience joy in your life. Christians in the New Testament, they were marginalized. The shepherds were marginalized. In the Old Testament, you had a group, widows, orphans, and refugees who were marginalized. And it's these people who Jesus seems to have a special heart for throughout the entire Bible. And it seems that Jesus came to bring joy for all of us, but for them most of all. So whether you consider yourself to be an outcast or an insider, Jesus came to bring you joy. He came to bring you joy that isn't primarily affected by the situation that you find yourself in, but rather you find this joy through faith, hope, and love in Jesus. Over the past couple of months, my joy levels have been all over the place at different times. Much of any joy I've been able to experience has been primarily determined by the situation that I found myself in. Then on Friday night, I was at Shorncliffe with some people from our church, and I was able to take my boy for a little walk along the water. And as I was walking along at Shorncliffe along the water, I just looked at the sky, and I was able to remember and think of this message here this morning, and just remember on this still night, this very calm night, how similar that night would have been to the night that Jesus came. And it was in that moment that I was just able to remember this truth in a moment. Because it was in that moment that I was able to not find joy, but choose joy. It wasn't really dependent on any situation, but it was a choice. Choosing finding joy. Joy, it's a choice that you make. It's something that you strive and you fight for, and you only find it in Jesus. The angels, they came to present good news of great joy to the shepherds. But they were the shepherds, who actively needed to get up and leave their flocks and make their way to Jesus. Yes, they were presented with that news, but they still needed to make the movement to go to Jesus, to choose Jesus. These outcasts rocked up at Mary and Joseph's house, probably feeling like they would have been cast out because of their status. It would have made very much sense for Mary and Joseph to say, "You are not welcome here right now." But they decided instead, despite their status in society, that they would still choose Jesus, that they would still strive for Jesus. And it's because of that, because they chose in that moment Jesus, that they experienced a joy like they had never seen before. And so for you today, in this lead up to Christmas, which is a great time for many, but a difficult time for so many people in life as well, irrelevant of what is going on in your life, don't let your situation or your circumstance in life rob you of your joy. Don't ignore what's going on in your life. Whether it's difficult, whether it's wonderful, don't allow that to just be pushed to the side. But in the midst of that, choose joy. Strive for it. Fight for it. And experience it to the utmost in Jesus. Strive for joy in your life. Can we stand together? And we're going to pray that the Holy Spirit might come even right now and just give us a renewed sense of joy in Jesus today. Jesus, you came to bring good news of great joy for all the people. You came to bring good news of great joy for everyone who is in this room today. And so, God, by your Spirit, come right now. Give us a renewed sense of joy in Jesus. Lord, I particularly pray for those who might be feeling like they're on the outside or they're not included in some way, in some aspect of society or in some group. And God, I pray for those people, most of all, would you give them joy? Would you remind them of the hope that you provide, of the love that you have given through Jesus? Lord, for all of us who have maybe not had a sense of joy in a little while, Lord, really push us by your Spirit to choose joy in our life. To not just look for it in the world here, but to choose it. Because we know that when we choose Jesus, we choose joy. So fill us with that afresh, King Jesus, in your name. Amen.